Professor of Neuropharmacology at the Conway Institute in UCD, and his specialities will be plasticity and memory. And Ciaran's going to speak this evening for around 15 minutes in and around that. See how we go. Then we'll do questions and answers. We have food this evening as well, so that'll come around 8 o'clock, and we'll go on for as long as people have questions. So again, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out tonight. I know it's a cold evening, and hopefully we'll all enjoy ourselves. Thanks a million.
So thanks very much to Judith for the kind invitation to come to the Alchemist's Cafe. As she indicated, I'm a neuropharmacologist, so I would deal with any drugs that affect the brain, and I'm happy to talk about any drugs that affect the brain, but beware, if you provoke me, it's an hour for each drug. So that would be my main bread and butter, what I do in the day, talk about any drug that affects the brain. My real academic interest is in memory, and memory fascinates me for lots and lots of reasons. And it fascinates me because of its survival quality, and it fascinates me as to how we store it. And again, if provoked, I can talk about those mechanisms, but I'm not going to talk about them now. I just want to talk in general about memory. And in thinking about this, I was to dinner last weekend with a very old friend, a neighbour. She's an absolute master of Indian cuisine because of her many decades abroad in the service of Trochara. Or was it Concern? One. In any event, the Cleo is also an avowed Dublin working class person. And for whatever reason, during dinner, the conversation switched to the idea of clapping songs. It's very typical working class, where you've got the freedom of the street. And these clapping songs are passed down from generation to generation, and they're rhyming songs as well. And it was quite interesting for me listening to her talk about it, because when you think about clapping songs, you're talking about information being passed in a very, very unusual way. It's a very, very organized way. So you've got clapping, you can clap with your partner, and then there's a song going with it. And she could recall these songs with remarkable accuracy. Now, you all know the songs. Ring a roses, pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down. Quite interesting, because a lot of people have interpreted that as being information in respect to the plague, the lesion on the face, the rose. You've also then got the posy to protect you against the plague. You then have got a tissue, and of course that's the fatal sign, and you fall down. It's really quite interesting why we would have this clapping event, why we would have this dancing event, and why you would have it in that type of street culture. And Cleo had her own version, and I actually jotted it down because it truly fascinated me. I hope I have it here, and I hope I get it right. Where are you going, Bob? Down the lane, Bob. For what, Bob? For rhubarb. Can I go, Bob? No, Bob. Why, Bob? Because you don't like you, Bob, meaning to rhyme with rhubarb. Now, why you might look at, or why you might have a rhyme like that fascinating, its content absolutely fascinated me. Now, my wife is an avid amateur historian. She tells me that the Duke of Wellington never went anywhere without a rhubarb pill in his medicine cabinet. But why this rhubarb also caught my attention. And for me, that little rhyme, it was quite evil. I mean, why he was going down a back lane, why there was this involvement of rhubarb. And I've not answered it, and I'm just bringing it up because somebody might have the answer to it. What fascinates me is not so much the rhyme, it's the way that the rhyme is dealt with. It's a clapping. So what is happening here is that it's the perfect way to store information. Repetition. Say it again, again, again. Anyone who's a teacher, tell them again, again, and again, and hopefully they will actually remember it. the other thing that's really interesting is that in this street culture, typically working class, you have a situation that it is really only carried out by children around 7 to 12 years. That's interesting, because that's the time where the brain is beginning to take on its ultimate formation. This is the time when you're getting sculpting of the circuits that are going to actually last with you throughout life. And I suppose that was something that struck me very strongly in coming to talk here in the general way about memory and what it might mean. And I better pull out my road map or I will get absolutely lost. For me, you're looking at a situation that is changing somebody for the rest of their life. And it's intergenerational. It's passed on. And in some cases, we know that it has got valuable information which is going to be there to actually support you. Now, if I return to the food theory again, or the food issue again, because we were with Cleo having lovely Indian food, I know on mainland China that there is a spice, and I don't know what the spice is, but I know if I have a mouthful of food with that spice, I'll immediately vomit. I haven't identified it yet, and I really don't know what it is. But somehow I must have been exposed to something, as a child possibly, whereby that spice or something akin to that spice made me ill. And there it is again in your subconscious, in your memory, and to the extent that it will evoke a very physical reaction from me if I actually take that spice. So memory forms the most remarkable patterns within us. Okay? So that would be my first point, and it's intergenerational. Things are passed on, word of mouth, in a repetitive way, to put in that information, and in the most formative time, and in rote learning mechanisms. So, for me, as an academic, how we store that information is absolutely fascinating. And really, in the last, I would say, 20 years, huge progress has been made in understanding how we might actually process that information. And it would seem that we now know certain brain areas are crucial for processing information. We know that because if they become damaged, an individual can't recall information, can't process information. There are lots of examples of that. We also know when we go down to the microscopic level that as an individual is processing information in those areas that we know are necessary for that processing of information, that we get change in the connection of the nerve cells. In other words, the system is constantly remodeling, changing its connections. And that has another interesting aspect, because in that aspect, it generates a mechanism, or it provides a mechanism where every single one of us can be unique. We're actually free in terms of how our brain becomes structured and how we're going to exist for the rest of our life and how we're going to interact with other individuals. At the moment, the big conundrum is how that information then is fractionated and stored in the cortex, that crenulated structure like a walnut, which we all know so well from pictures. How that is done is another day's story and another day's great degree of speculation. But what is emerging continually is that with repetitive rote learning, or where you have a memory that becomes so strong because it has a very significant association with the birth of a child, car accident, that these are embedded really very, very tightly. So much so that these sort of mechanisms can explain post-traumatic stress disorder, which you can see with individuals who have suffered the ultimate in trauma. So we have a mechanism that potentially makes every single one of us unique and individual. That's very attractive to me. But it's more important because now we're beginning to realize that those brain areas that actually process that information, they're not only involved in recalling it. If, for example, you want to recall an event, that brain area will become active. But if you want to plan your future, if you want to think about your life, if you want to boil down to your very imagination, the same area becomes active. These brain regions are absolutely intimate to the way you act, even to how you interact with an individual. If, for example, you're negotiating with an individual, you're going to buy a car, you're trying to work out with that individual, well, how far can I go with this? How far can I push the price? How is that individual responding to what I suggest? This is what we call theory of mind. The same brain regions are involved. So your whole existence, your whole interaction, your whole reason of living, your individuality can be attributed to this type of processing within the brain. These traces that remain, and over time with repetitive action, they become indelible. And through cultural transmission can be further put to your children. So it's a very dynamic system, memory, a truly dynamic system. Sorry. But whenever you talk about memory, invariably, what happens next is, what about Alzheimer's disease? And of course, that is a devastating condition. Here you get an entire unraveling of the memory process. Yes, these individuals, they can't recall, but equally, they can't plan their future. They can't understand how they're interacting with a person. All of this degenerates. And what's happening is the traces are degenerating. The very elements of those connections are falling apart. The ability or the plasticity that allows you to generate new connections, it's lost. It's completely degenerating. And this is Alzheimer's disease. And everybody knows Alzheimer's disease. Everybody knows an individual who is suffering dementia. Not always Alzheimer's disease. There are many different types of dementia. But in essence, their ability to work, their ability to interact is lost. They cannot recognize an individual. They can no longer form sentences. They can no longer have purposeful movement. That is really the devastation we see when memory is lost. But it fascinates me that it's always Alzheimer's disease, never another disease. And yet, some of the other most devastating conditions that we have are due to memory impairment. Not the type of memory that you might actually think is associated with recall. Take schizophrenia, for example. The major problem in schizophrenia is cognitive deficit. But it's not a cognitive deficit like you would see in Alzheimer's disease, where you've lost a recall action. Here, what the individual is suffering is an inability to actually understand salience, the salience of what's happening in their life, to relate that salience to what they have actually stored. It's blocked. It occurs in a very specific part of the brain, in the frontal area of the brain, whereas your Alzheimer's condition is in the lateral sides of the brain. So you have here a situation where you have marked cognitive deficits. That's why drugs don't work, because they fail to actually correct the cognitive deficits. They will tranquilize an individual. They will help calm that individual, but they won't get rid of the cognitive deficits. And it's only in very recent times that it's become clear that individuals suffering depression, unipolar depression, major depressive disorder, in those individuals, what you find is that over 50% of those individuals have some sort of cognitive upset. So for me, memory is a most dynamic function. It is a remarkable function that allows you survive. It allows you to be successful. And it absolutely devastates those in which it's impaired. So, Judith, 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Alan. That was very, very useful. So what we'll do is we'll do questions and answers now, if that's
fine.
okay. And we'll keep on going until the food comes, take a break, and then we'll resume again. All right? Does anybody have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
About the memory, if you would ask me to list all the animals, I obviously know a lot of names of animals, but I would probably mention just a few of them. But if you ask me tomorrow, probably I would say some other ones. So I know a lot of information, I just cannot recall it at this time. But let's say in 2 hours, I would remember other names or other animal names or whatever the information is that I would not necessarily mention a few hours ago. How is it possible that the information is there, it's just somehow cannot be accessed?
I don't think it's a case that it can't be accessed, because really when you're talking about recall, and let's say you're talking about, as you suggest, animal names, or they could be names of many aspects, it could be car engine parts. You have to remember that the way memory is stored within the cortex is very, very unique. So it's fragmented, it seems. So if I were to take words, okay, we speak words, we hear words, we recognize words. When now those words are eventually stored in your cortex, they're in different locations. So the speaking aspect will be in one location, the location that controls the muscles that will actually form the words. The recognition of the word, if you're reading, for example, is going to be in another area, the visual cortex, which is tuned for that. So we have memory scattered in different pockets. And this is the real conundrum that I didn't go towards, but will now. So the whole trick is how you link all of that together. So we can start talking about your animal system. You may have a visual image of it, you may have a sound image of it. And these areas have this stored. And it seems that when it goes elephant, these systems suddenly become active and suddenly cease. It's as if they are gelled together, and that generates concept. So this touches then on the tricky situation of consciousness. And this is really the element of your conscious understanding of those groupings that you want to work on. Now you can maybe extend it into what you're really moving towards, because what you're doing is you're relating different things. And it's a process that can take time. And then you get to that aha notion. And here you have the concept put together. So we've got to separate how we process information for long-term storage and how we use that information in long-term storage. So they're back to the area that processes it. Here what we've got to do is we've got to recall what we want, the elephant, right? And that has to be taken out and held online, so to speak, like a telephone book. It's the frontal part again. They actually call it working memory. And it's sometimes referred to as non-declarative memory. You can't really say what you're thinking. What you're doing is you gather, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but you're gathering together your ideas and you're forming them into a whole. And that's where the concept comes out. And again, in schizophrenia, this is where they can't manage it, because that particular system has crashed. And you can show that with a whole array of of measurements, of tasks. And you can see where individuals, where that frontal area is gone, is broken down. And it's also incredibly important in respect of your social interactions. If you get damage there, now you've got a situation where that individual will show inappropriate behavior. There's a great story of Phineas Cage. I don't know if people have heard this story. He was a ganger in Vermont, putting through a railway, and with a tamping iron, which is a long rod, was putting in explosive, tamping it down with a tissue, and then they could blow the rock. But of course he slipped, and he hadn't got his tamping pad in, sparked, and the tamping rod shot through, and it went straight through this eye here and out that part of the skull and shot up into the air. And he survived, but he did damage to the frontal cortex. And in that individual, after survival, he became totally irascible. He was impossible in social situations. And there's another more modern day analogy, which is substance abuse. So if you take an individual who is, for example, abusing cocaine, okay, what you find is the activity, the metabolic activity, which is necessary to keep your nerve cells running, here it's really depressed in the frontal area. And you can, well, I won't go into the biochemical, the pharmacological story, but basically you've got depressed activity there. And those individuals no longer see salience. They don't see the relationship of the drug they're using to the environment that they're living in, to the family that they're living in. All of that's gone. And on top of that, their inhibitory control is gone. So now they can start binging, taking in vast amount of drugs. Inhibitory control is lost, and you're spiraling down into this very dreadful state. And again, it is a memory system that controls how we interact with people, which has been upset. Sorry, I did warn you about the 1 hour. I'll stop.
Are there any chemical elements like that which would enhance your ability to remember things, or
Yeah.
or say if you eat, the way you eat lots of carrots and you can see in the dark, if you eat lots of bananas, could you remember everything?
Okay, so I'll deal with the carrots first. Basically, we're all very lucky in that we all enjoy a healthy diet and a good lifestyle. So I think that the idea that these various foods might suggest to you, or food providers might suggest to you that, eating their yogurt is going to make you very bright, I don't think that actually works. Now, if you had a situation where you'd malnourishment, or if, for example, it's a situation where there was damage, they may provide a protective action that prevents further degeneration, because they're very rich in these polyphenols, red wine, and these actually protect the brain because they have antioxidant qualities. But chemicals and how they might influence memory, yes, that's an hour's lecture. But food, I'm not so enthusiastic that it will actually show these remarkable effects unless there's a deficit in there originally.
Is it true that we need to sleep to remember?
Oh, yeah, I forgot that bit. Oh, that's Bart. Oh, hi, Bart. Bart is a PhD student with us. He's a mole. I forgot, and thank you for reminding me. So, let's say we're dealing with memory, and we're dealing with this idea of traces and repetitiveness of putting in the trace. The trace is truly hammered into place during sleep, and especially in our in our dreaming phases of sleep. And it would seem from experiments using animals that what happens is that in those sleeping period, the actual circuits that were activated in the experiences of that day are replayed again and again and again. So like the clapping game, what we're having in this type of sleep is a replay of these experiences in which the actual memory is hammered into place. Is that okay, Bart? Yeah.
Two questions actually. Firstly, in terms of treatment for like people with unipolar depression, things like that, and you're saying that it's to do with their memory, like what sort of influence does that have on future research, or like what can be done for these conditions, considering that it's memory that's affected?
Okay, so really the idea of cognitive upset being associated with depression is very new. So that's point number one. So the drugs that are currently used to treat depression do not have any major impact on that particular function. The problem is that the cognitive upsets are so profound that this will lead individuals to suicide. So you get a huge incidence of suicide in those individuals. Now, the drugs that we're dealing with, the very curious aspect about these drugs is that they take so long to show the minimal beneficial effects that they can exert. And this has fascinated people because the drug is there in sufficient quantity, it is working as it should be working, and yet it is not lifting the depression. So that has always been a great conundrum. It's actually so bad that 50% of the scripts written for antidepressants will not be renewed by the individual because, one, the depression, and two, they're not having an impact. Now, in recent times, there has been a flurry of activity in relation to the idea that these drugs actually facilitate laying down of new traces, and that you can get activities within the brain that take a long time to actually be laid down, and that these begin to emerge at time when you see the effect of the antidepressant beginning to emerge. And a lot of those would be associated with the area of the brain that processes information. So your question is quite relevant. It may be that there is a relationship there, but that relationship hasn't been hammered out with any certainty as yet.
And just one more thing for myself. Deja vu, how do you explain that?
Okay. Probably not very well. Deja vu, I mean, again, deja vu probably is something related to consciousness. It is probably, I don't know is the answer, okay? Probably related to consciousness. It is probably related to the activation of numerous areas which relate to the experience that one is having, and you get that sense.